All right, welcome. So it is good to be back. And we'll give everybody a couple minutes to kind of come in. How was your week?
My week was good. Not enough hours in the day. Today is a Monday, so this is a busy Monday. So I'm running, but I'm excited about this 30 minutes. How was your week?
It was good. It was good. As we were talking, I'm in Chicago. Supposed to be flying home today.
You snowed
It
in. You going
snowed
over?
last night, so you start getting those messages from the airlines like,
Mhm.
"Hey, either be open to delays or be open to changes."
Yeah.
So we'll see. I mean, it snowed last night, so I mean, yesterday, well, 2 days ago it snowed, so we were shoveling to get the car out of the parking lot. And then it snowed again today, so we're like, okay, all right, we'll see what the airlines are gonna do.
Yeah, you're gonna be there another day or two. Get ready for that. Hope you had nothing pressing back here in the Carolinas that can't be handled virtually.
I hope it's one of those things that I feel like when I travel sometimes, like trying to work from a different setup,
It's
that
hard.
just it takes a little bit more for me to kind of get into the rhythm of what I need to get done.
Right. I understand. I'm just saying, I like to be in my own space. Now, I'm
Mhm.
grateful for virtual work. I got a laptop, I can do most things, but I like to be in my space where I'm familiar with, I can need to put my hands on. So, yeah, I'm a creature of habit, though.
Mhm. Yeah, I completely understand that. I understand that. So, I mean, last week, one of the things we talked about was, we talked about contracts and, contracts in the church world. And I do think that I've gotten several responses from different people about how grateful they were. Can you talk about like some of the responses you got from last week?
Absolutely. People are excited about the show. I've heard that me and you should go on the road. We should do conferences. We should offer package deals. But it was a whole lot of gratitude because a lot of times people don't know what they don't know. So it's a blessing that we can come out and just kind of give out this information that doesn't take a lot of our time, but it's going to be extremely helpful to a lot of ministries. And so that's kind of the feedback I got. I got lots of pastors who want to know who can listen. Can they deacons listen? I said anyone who has Facebook, YouTube, can listen. They want to know are the segments recorded. I said, well, you can always go back to my page. Then they want to know, can I email them out? And I said, we don't have no assistance for this yet, but we'll see what we can do. But no, the feedback was really, really, really good. Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm glad the feedback is good. I will tell everyone that is listening, we will create a podcast for this series.
Oh, yay.
But we are as Harriet mentioned, we don't have any assistance for
No.
this. I
Now,
mean, this
somebody from the church secretary want to volunteer their time to help us with this technology ministry. Y'all hit us up. Right? Yeah.
definitely. But yeah, I'm glad because I got some of the same feedback where people said the same thing. They really enjoy the information and the context because I think our goal is really to shine a light on topics that, you know, things that eventually could cause a church, distract a church from its mission.
That's it.
Because it's not so much just to say, hey, you know what, we started a church that your church should not, that you should forget about your mission and just focus on the administrative side. No, it's like, no, we want you to be able to focus on your mission, but we want to bring some clarity to some of the administrative things so they don't stop you from achieving your mission. Because it's one of those things I've seen from a lot of churches where that becomes like, where a church that was doing a great thing, having an impact, but things just fell apart because there were some administrative things behind the scene on the legal and the financial side that they
Right.
just did not have in order. And it's like,
Right.
man, that could have been avoided.
Right. Right. So that's it. That's the goal. We do the heavy lifting so y'all can spread the good news of Jesus and do outreach in your communities the right way. That's it.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things we wanted to dive into a little bit more this week, as we said last week, we just talked about contracts in general. I mean, where you have agreements with someone who's coming in doing some work in the church, and some of the things we talked about there is that the contract allows you to get a common understanding, because the time of just doing things over handshakes and stuff like that, it's I'm not going to say that, hey, you know what, that things can't get done that way. But what I will say is they open the door for a ton of confusion, and they open the door for misunderstanding that can become an absolute distraction for your mission and what the church is about. So we talked about that in general. Now, this week, we wanted to dive a little bit more because Harriet mentioned this one that I thought was a really good one is, when it comes down to, your pastors and your ministers, it's should you have a contract with your pastor and your minister? So we'll start with that question. So, Harry, from your perspective, the question is, should you have a contract for your pastors and your ministers?
You absolutely should. So the quick answer is yes. It's a business relationship, right? The pastor works for the church. I find this most commonly in the non-denominational churches who we kind of creating our own structure. So yeah, you need a contract that spells out terms, what it should be, what you expect, what they expect, so we're all on the same page. So that's the short answer without me diving deeper.
Absolutely. And I would say, even from a financial standpoint, I think that it is it is best practice to definitely have a contract with clarity and terms laid out, which I know that there are some denominations that may look at that, or some people in general may look at that and say, well, does that change because we're treating us, they're here under a contract. Does that cause a spiritual implication for it? Or are they no longer going to be as an effective pastor if they are under contract? And, from what I would say is, we're not here to interpret scripture in that context. What we are here, we're going to tell you from a legal and from a finance standpoint, here is what we would recommend, and we're going to dive into a little bit more why. So now that you've kind of given us the short answer from the legal aspect, what's the why behind the reason why you say a church should have a contract?
I think there's a plethora of reasons why the church should have a contract. The first would be clarity, like you say, clarity, right? So we need to understand, you're going to come here and preach sermons, and we're going to pay you X amount of money. But that should be spelled out, because a pastor does a whole lot more than come on Sunday and preach a sermon, right? And then go. So what are the church's expectations of the pastor? Are you to visit the sick? Are you to perform funerals and weddings, right? Are you to sit on the board or report to a board? How does that work? So those things are just some of the things that need to be spelled out. Is the pastor going to get $200 a Sunday, or is this a big church where he's going to get $2,000 or $5,000 a Sunday with insurance benefits and a 401k and all those other things? And so it is spiritual, but the church is a business, and a lot of times I find that not enough churches treat it as such, right? And so I think that those expectations should be really, really clear. There are 52 Sundays in a year. We're going to pay you X amount of money. Maybe you get 4 Sundays off, but we expect you to preach 48 of them. You know what I mean? And it works for both sides. It protects the church and it protects the pastor, because maybe the pastor say, hey, I didn't agree to all of this. The COVID pandemic came. I'm doing funerals every day, right? For the last 2 years. And you want me to go visit the sick? People contagious out here. You know what I mean? And it's like, not to make light of real situations, but it becomes, is this the pastor's full-time job, or can he work another job? What's the church's expectation? What's the pastor's expectation? And are we on the same page? Because it's a business. It protects both ends.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, I remember when, one of my roles when I was a minister on staff early in my professional career, when I was doing both, one of my responsibilities was to do hospital visitation. And one of the things that I realized is visiting sick people can take a serious toll on you. I mean,
and not just your time, mentally. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, which I think about during that time is just, and even on an emotional standpoint, it's just the number of people that you had to sit there and hold someone's hand when they received a diagnosis that wasn't good. And you had to be the one who stood strong for them in the gap, or either console their family and stuff. And it's just like, man, it wore you out to where if on top of that, you have to go, prepare a sermon, you got to preach a funeral, you got to perform a wedding, you got to do a baptism, and you got to preach a sermon. Like, that is a lot.
And can I be honest? A lot of times, I respect pastors because the church ain't really paying you enough to do all of this. You're doing this because you got a calling from God and a love for people. Because if you're really pastoring the way you need to pastor, ain't a whole lot of monetary value you can put on that. That's a lot of time, and praying for people, it wears on you. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you said, it's a lot. It's a lot. And you're supposed to have a life too. It's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, and I do think from a organizational standpoint, one of the huge benefits that having a contract in place, what it does is it allows you to objectively lay out what do we expect this person to do. Then you can get a sober perspective on it, like, hey, after we listed all this stuff out, is this realistic? Like, is this realistic to put on one person?
Right.
And I think a lot of times from a lot of churches where when they don't actually lay this stuff out in terms and just see it plainly in writing, is they never give themselves the chance to ask that honest question of, is this too much for one person?
Right.
And when you don't ask that question, you can't ask an even more powerful question is, hey, if these are all the things that we need to do for our members, should we hire other associate pastors? And what should the associate pastors do versus, the head pastor?
Another catch is, if your head pastor has to do all of these things on this list, then when does he have time to hear from God so he can preach to you? Right? Because isn't that one of the most important things of why we gather here, to learn the word of God? So I think for me, seeing it in black and white helps to make those decisions. This is realistic, or this is unrealistic, And a lot of churches, I might not be able to afford to pay more than one person. But are there deacons or elders or other people in here not on salary who can take on some of this responsibility?
Absolutely. I mean, because one of the things that I've seen, from just talking to different leaders in different churches, different organizations, one of the things that I've really seen them kind of struggle with at times is where, they have all these responsibilities, all these things that need to be done. But since they've never actually taken the time to really write it out and make it plain, they don't know how to divide up the responsibility. So eventually you end up having 3 people who are doing the work, and you got, 10 elders, and only 3 of them are actually working, and the pastor. And it's like they're always exhausted. And you have other people who are on a board for namesake only, which some of those responsibilities could be passed to some of the other 7 that aren't really doing much. But I think if you don't really lay out what those responsibilities and those expectations are, then what's going to happen is you're going to have a few select people that end up doing all the work, and other people who are there, they may be willing and able to do the work, but they just don't know what needs to be done.
Right. And that's going to be in any church, regardless of size. 20% of the people do 80% of the work in most ministries. That's whether your church has 50 people or 50,000 people. And so you do want to lighten the load, but you need to be organized. And maybe, churches don't know, well, how do I break it down? Or we've not thought through this. So, that's when you can call me or Terrell. We can help you guys with strategic planning, right? These are some things that you need to consider. Right? And maybe we need to put some literature together, Terrell, like 1 pages of consider these things, right? To help people. But yeah, the more thought you put into it, how does all of this relate to contracts? Because even on the people who are not being paid, I think the churches need to have volunteer agreements, because there are liabilities even when sending someone unpaid out in the name of the church to represent the church, right? And something goes wrong, then who becomes liable? Was it Mr. Deacon who was trying to do the right thing and didn't know what he was doing? No, people are going to sue the church. I see that. So contracts and agreements are just, that spells out terms are just necessary across the board.
Absolutely. I mean, because from a finance standpoint, I'll take it from what you talked about, like, if you have a person who's going out there in the name of the church, what part of what a contract also spells out is what level of authority do they have? Because what you don't want is a person who has a title in the organization to go out and then take out a loan in the name of the organization. They may have been doing what they thought was best, but if it was never spelled out what their level of authority is, you could find your church having this surprise new loan of this bill that they need to pay. And they're like, well, none of the people who should approve that were involved in that decision. and it just causes problem. And I've seen that happen before, to where it was because they had elders or they had deacons, and they didn't lay out what level of authority does a deacon or elder have, because they went to some, third party financial institution because they had a card, or let's say they had a card with their name and it was elder of such and such church. They had access to, to internal information of the organization. They end up signing a loan. Now the church is on the hook for this loan, and people are upset. They're like, well, we didn't want this loan. The church didn't need this. And it just caused problem. And part of that was because the responsibilities and authority were not clearly laid out.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that. The legal term for what you just described is called apparent authority. That's the legal term. They had apparent authority. And either the church knew or should have known that you had people going in the church's name and putting you on the hook for businesses. I've seen lawsuits like that in church. So-and-so came to the meeting. Maybe you ran about a pastor. You didn't. But they had the signatory authority to walk into a bank, like you said, third party, and sign a $500,000 loan. And then they take that money and run off, and the church is stuck holding the bag. And when you don't pay the bank, the church gets sued. And the church is like, we need our money, right? Because whatever internal dysfunction y'all have going on, it does not take away from the fact that we loan money to this church in good faith on apparent authority that someone who holds a title came in here and signed all the documents. So you're now legally responsible. Happens every day. So if things are spelled out, who can bind the church in contracts, who has signatory authority on funds, all of those things need to be spelled out. And a lot of times it may be the pastor, and you need a board. You don't just need a board to say you have a board, because to get 501c3 exempt status, you got to put 5 names who are unrelated on the paperwork, on the form 1023 IRS form. You need a board to govern, to make sure that these things don't happen, that you're not wasting the Lord's resources by conducting bad business. I always say, when Jesus called the disciples, he called businessmen to carry the good news, who knew how to organize and function and structure. He knew he wasn't going to be here long, but they could carry it on because they knew how to run stuff. And I think we should kind of take that example in our churches today. And I'm not saying that everybody in church got to be a businessman, right? But if you don't know something, then you need to consult with somebody who does know in that area to come in and teach you guys or give you guidance if you can't afford to outsource it to a third party to handle it for you. And contracts is a major part of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and I think even piggybacking off of, something you said about, with the apparent authority, is one of the things that I've also seen some churches have some issues with, is where you had a minister, you had a pastor, you had a administrator on staff. They were one of the, one of the signatures on the bank. Like the bank knew, hey, this person can sign for these type of things. Well, let's say if that person leaves the church, or that person goes somewhere else, or they're no longer employed by the church. What I have seen is a lot of churches don't go back to the bank to update that signature list. Mm-hmm. So now this person who is no longer a member, no longer affiliated here, still has the authority to sign and write checks in the name of the church. Right. And I've seen that turn out to be very bad. They'll say in most cases, you're probably, if the person left on good terms, you're probably not going to have as much of an issue. But it is a regular practice that should be, is like, hey, we need to review this on an annual basis. Like, who has the authority to sign the church's name on financial documents, and make sure you agree that that list is current. Because if not, it opens you up to a ton of issues. Because as you said, from the bank's perspective, they were like, hey, we just let the person you said was approved. We didn't know that your list wasn't up to date. We gave this person a loan. We still expect you to pay it.
That's it. And it should not just be churches need checks and balances. It should not just be your pastor as the signatory, right? Or your pastor and his homeboy, buddy, deacon, trustee. You need disinterested persons, because you have to agree and make decisions that are in the best financial interest of the church. It's a conflict of interest for a person to unilaterally, that means on their own, make financial decisions for your church, right? It shouldn't be. There should be a discussion, a majority vote, because when you're tax exempt, especially, these things matter, because the government gives you a pass and you don't get as much scrutiny on your money initially if nothing's going wrong. but you have to operate in these standards and these procedures that make sure you are on the up and up with this tax-free money. It's critical, and I just see too many times it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, and it causes problems, and you don't know it's a problem until it goes wrong, right?
Yeah.
And now you got a bigger issue.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, one of the things that I have seen from a financial standpoint as to why contracts become a very necessary thing is that, for if you're a minister, there are certain, tax advantages or tax treatment that ministers get that you don't get as a normal person. For example, like one of the big ones is like a housing allowance. Like housing allowances are where the church can actually give the minister a set sum of money, or they can pay for their housing, and that money will not be included in their income. And so one of the things that I have seen some people run some issues with is where, they decide that they want to give the minister a housing allowance, and they're giving the minister a housing allowance. But since there are no very clear written documents of what this person is responsible for, when that comes up for audit with the IRS is going to ask, okay, all right, this person is receiving this amount of money, and you may say, well, it's a housing allowance. Well, then the question is, okay, all right, what is the list of this person's responsibility? Because you might call them a pastor, you might call them a minister. That's what you call them. But the IRS says, okay, we want to see what are their responsibilities, and does it meet our definition?
Right.
Well, if you don't have their responsibilities listed or written out, there is nothing you have to defend in an audit, which means now the IRS is going to say, well, all this money that you gave to this person is now taxable, because there's nothing in writing that tells us and meets our definition that this person is a minister. So, and it's one of those things that I say, even if you're in a denomination that says, well, we don't really feel like we need a contract, you may not necessarily need it for your denomination. But when it comes down to dealing with an external party like the IRS, they have very clear definitions on who is and who isn't a minister. And just because you have a title doesn't mean that you automatically meet their definition.
Right. And it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Right. So it's just good business practices. And I know we don't often think of the church as a business, but the church is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And a lot of the funds aren't accounted for properly, and you don't know if they're being managed properly because a lot of churches, too many churches, don't have the proper procedures in place to make sure we're doing what's necessary. And I want to piggyback. This is a free nugget for the pastors who get the housing allowance so that you don't have to pay taxes. That's real cute if you're not trying to do anything in your life. But to be able to go out and buy houses and get loans and do other things, if your church ain't footing the bill for your whole lifestyle, you need to be able to show that you have an income, right? And so if you're sinking your church salary into a housing allowance where it's not taxable, if you need to make a financial move that demonstrates that you're making money, you're going to catch the short end of the stick. Because your church, what's the maximum you can put in a housing allowance? Is it 40 or 50K?
Well, it depends on it just has to be approved by the church. So it may vary, but the main thing is it has to be approved in writing before the payments are made.
Before they're made, not retroactive. After the IRS comes in and you're being audited.
Yes.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. Right, you caught my joke. I'm sarcastic. I'm sorry. So when pastors are getting housing allowance, does that go on a 1099 as compensation, or how is that in the tax roll? How is that accounted for?
Yeah. So when a pastor is getting a housing allowance, it can be put on a 1099 or it can put on their W-2, but it will go in a special box that is not taxable.
Not taxable.
Because now some churches, with the housing allowance, they don't put it on the 1099 at all. Because like I said, you're not required to report it. Because like I said, it's non-taxable, as long as, like I said, in the background, you have it documented of, hey, the board has approved or the church has committed to give XYZ pastor this amount of money, and any money that they give throughout the year, if it exceeds that, then it is not considered part of the housing allowance.
Got
So
it.
if you give them any money that exceeds what you agreed to beforehand, then that should be included on the 1099 as compensation.
Got it.
But if it's under that limit, then you can report it on the W-2 in a non-taxable box, or you don't have to report it.
Got you. Got you. While we're talking about pastors and pastors' compensation, a lot of times I see with pastors that it depends on where you are, but they pastor and preach their whole lives. A lot of pastors can't retire because they can't afford to. And so you might have been at a church full time forever, but you weren't getting retirement. You weren't getting these benefits that having an employment contract typically gains you. There is no 401k plan that the church is putting 3% of your salary in and giving you the option to match. And so I find you're preaching, not that everybody retires at 60, but you're 60, 70, 75, 85, 89 on a cane, and you still got to go out to the church house and preach because you're still living week to week. And I just think that churches should start, pastors themselves to say, hey, if I'm going to be here full time, let's look at an employment contract with a compensation package that makes this like this is a full-time job for me, so I can take care of my family 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And I just see a lot of churches don't do that for their pastors.
Absolutely. I mean, because I think the reality of it is for pastors, one of the unfortunate things that you see happen probably more often than it should is where you have a pastor that's married or then they have children. That pastor, something happens to that pastor, where that pastor dies or is unable to continue pastoring. And now they were the sole source of income because, being a pastor, being a minister, sometimes that's not just a full-time job for the person, that's a full-time job for the family. And so there's nothing else that the family can do. But I think when you put yourself in that position where, like I said, if it's not clearly laid out, like, hey, we don't, the church is not going to provide retirement or provide benefits, or even if it's I guess a disability insurance to where something happens to the pastor.
Yeah.
Or something like if life insurance isn't included in the package. Like those are things that a pastor and minister should understand. So then they can be wise about the other areas of their life to say, okay, all right, if I know that my contract does not include, let's say if it doesn't include health benefits, it doesn't include disability insurance or life insurance or a retirement, then you know that you have to find some other way to get those things addressed. Because if you don't, then you're going to suffer personally, which could eventually affect you actually doing your job as a pastor, as a minister.
I want to piggyback on that as well. You're getting paid from the church. Are they paying Social Security taxes on your behalf? Because if you work at the church for 40 years, but you don't have the necessary units for Social Security, so where everybody else gets a Social Security check, you don't get it because you got all your money up front in your housing allowance that you didn't account for. And so now when you need the supplemental income in your old age, you don't have it. And so another thing I have, maybe you're a pastor and you go to the church and the church doesn't offer it. I have pastor friends who call me to negotiate their contracts with churches for them. Now, this does not just contingent upon a church size, but I have pastor friends that say, hey, I got this job offer at this church, Harriet. Can you come with me, or can you review my contract? See, what are some things that I should consider? Right? And so you don't have to know everything, but Terrell and I are sharing things that you need to think about, because I don't want pastors to spend their life preaching the gospel, serving God's people, but you can't ever retire. And like I said, you die. You know what's going to happen if the pastor dies prematurely? The church is going to get a new pastor. And that first lady and those children, if they stay there, that's not going to be your role no more. So there's no more pastor's appreciation when y'all getting these love offerings. They're going to have a funeral, serve you chicken, and tell you bye-bye while they vote on their new pastor. So I want pastors to be able to care for their families as well. No, seriously, that's what they do. Right? Y'all excuse my jokes. Now, I'm telling y'all, I'm sarcastic, but I mean it in love. But it's real stuff. And so contracts benefit the church, and it benefits the employee, the pastor. So that's why they're really, really necessary. Both sides can benefit when they're done correctly.
Absolutely. I laugh because I completely get it, and the thing is, like, I've seen that happen before, where the pastor dies, and their wife wasn't working because she was, I mean, like I said, I mean, being a pastor
She
is
ran the
not just a
women's
job for that
ministry.
person.
She ran the women's ministry, and she sat in his counseling sessions with him with other women, so they wouldn't try to sleep with him. That's the truth. She was
Yep.
full time.
So she didn't have time to go get a job herself. So then the pastor dies. Now the family's income is gone. The housing allowance they were getting is gone. The income is gone. And now this, mother of the church now has to find some way, other way to make a living when all of her time was,
At the church, and the
helping
church did
pastor
not
the
have an
church.
insurance policy on the pastor that made the wife the beneficiary should something happen to him. Right? And
Mhm.
churches, it can be even term life. Get a term life. You think he's gonna be a pastor for 5 or 10 years? Get a term life policy. Right? That's an option.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and I think as we're kind of getting closer to time, I think just kind of to reiterate. I mean, when it comes down to a contract, no matter what denomination or what kind of organizational structure you have, the contract is advantageous for the church. It is advantageous for the person that is being hired, or the person that is asked to be a pastor or a minister, because it protects all parties. One is it lays out what are the expectations, because one of the things that you don't want is you don't want a pastor that's working doing all these things, but they're not the things that you expected them to do. But the thing is, if you never had it in writing, you're going to run into an issue. So it clears up misunderstandings. It also protects the church financially of laying out what level of authority this person has, so that they're not able to sign the church's name to documents that they don't have the authority for. I mean, that contract lays this type of stuff out. And then also it lays out what are the benefit package, what are the things that are going to come along with it, because those things need to be understood coming into it. That way the pastor and their family can make whatever necessary decisions they need to make sure that their lives are going to be taken care of for all of the things that the church will not or is unable to cover. And I do think, you made a really good point as you talked about, working with, negotiations or with, pastors and their contract, because I think some people hear that and they immediately think, oh, that's so ungodly. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, can you shine a little bit of light on, like, what are some of the things that come up in those negotiations?
Mm-hmm. Some of the things that I see come up, like it's really expectation. So compensation, of course, that's a biggie. What is the church expecting? Those are the things I kind of named in the beginning. Am I only preaching on Sundays and doing Bible study? Am I also responsible for visiting the sick, or do you have a care pastor? Am I doing all funerals and weddings? Right? Do I get vacation time? Am I going to get paid Sundays off? You'd be amazed the amount of pastors who don't negotiate that. So if they don't come to church, they don't get a check. Right? Am I allowed to bring in guest speakers? When I bring in a guest speaker, does the church pay their honorarium in addition to pay me my salary for the week? So these are the things that we talk about. Am I getting insurance benefits, right? If I get insurance benefits, can I put my family, my wife, and my children on there? Is there a 401k plan? These are the things that we talk about, expectations. I got some pastors that they get 2 months off a year and time to go write their books. Now, these are the big churches, right? And
Yeah.
we're going to bring in my buddies, and I get $100,000, $200,000 honorarium budget to bring in my friends. It just depends on the size and the scale of the church. If I'm a small church and we're struggling, no, we need you here, Pastor. Right? We need you
Mhm.
here, and we're working through it. But we should talk about these things. And like you said, the short-term disability, the long-term disability. If I can no longer get up here and function every day, do y'all kick me out and throw me out with the trash and send my wife a peace lily? Like, these are the things, or my
Yeah.
husband, right? Because women are pastors too. These are the things that we discuss.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, definitely thank you guys for tuning in. As we said before, I mean, we are both running businesses and running firms ourselves, so we are not here to stay here all day.
Right. I got caught this afternoon. Clearly, but yes.
So thank you guys for tuning in. Definitely leave your comments, join the group, join the church and the church law and finance group on Facebook. There you can engage with different discussions we'll have going on. You can see different updates. We'll announce, like, hey, what the next episode topic is going to be, so you can share the word, tell your pastors, ministers, deacons, choir members, tell your ministers of music, your administrators, everyone, tell them to join the group to engage in the conversation. So thank you guys for tuning in for another week.